Hello, everyone, and good morning. Today is, let's see, I have to look at my computer. It's July 28th, 2022. How did it get to the end of July already? And welcome to We'll Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you know, these programs, they've been going on now for over 2 years. Natalie Armstrong-Moton was the founder and the brainchild behind it. Jeff Ketchaven began moderating, and it was my honor about 1.5 years ago now to have joined also in the moderation. And then Sari Aragami, she is the brains behind the administration of everything. So thank you for that. The number, what we do is we ask you to donate to food banks. Obviously, we don't ask for we don't charge anything for these programs. And so where are we, Jeff, at this point? I think it's a big day.
Thank you, Jean. It is a thrilling day. We have burst through the $300,000 mark. The grand total today is $300,985.25. So congratulations to all of our speakers who've motivated people to make these contributions, and thank you so much to our generous audiences. Jean, back to you.
That is so exciting and so fantastic. And you know, there was that question of which speaker would take us over the $300,000 mark. Jeff, which speaker was that, since you asked the question?
Well, it was not Neil Armstrong, and it was not Lance Armstrong. Wasn't even Natalie Armstrong. It was Natalie's dad, David Armstrong, who gave a wonderful presentation last week. So kudos, extra tip of the cap to the whole Armstrong family.
Right. And of course, it's everybody building up to it to today. So if you didn't see last week, it was very good, and you might go watch the video on that. But today we have a fantastic speaker, Candice Gottlieb-Clark, and she is a renowned business advisor, leadership coach, conflict manager, specialist, and she has a book, actually, several books, but her new book is called, and I'm looking here at her webpage, Find, Fix, Fill Your Leadership Gap. And that's just out. It's available on Amazon. And maybe after you've listened to this, you'll be interested in following up with that. The program today is Pillars of Success, Strengthening Your Conflict Management in 2022. After the challenges of COVID and all, we're really in a different world now. And so, Candice, why don't you take us to 2022 and beyond? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your food bank, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. And it's just a pleasure to be here with everyone. I first want to just honor what Natalie has created here, a community where we all win, right? The food banks are supported, and we're helping people that are struggling with food insecurity. We have people that are getting to learn and gain some knowledge that they're curious or interested in furthering, and people like myself who have the opportunity to share knowledge and wisdom that we love to share. So I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to share my screen, if I may, and then I'll talk a little bit about our food bank for this particular week. The food bank I am supporting this week is Food Bank of the Rockies. I moved to Colorado about 4 years ago, and that was pre-pandemic. And particularly during the pandemic, much like when Natalie began this We'll Work for Food podcast, webinar series, I realized that is where I wanted to put my resources as well. And that's one of the charitable donations that I found most important. And it's partly because it's local, but Food Bank of the Rockies supports not just Colorado, but the entire state of Wyoming through its resources. They have 800 partner affiliates that they support with their donations. And so it's really exciting to know that they're not just handling an urban center, but all the rural areas as well. And to anybody who chooses to donate today, thank you on behalf of myself and Food Bank of the Rockies. To tell you a bit about myself and the program today, Candice Gottlieb-Clark, I know Jean said that, but sometimes we get away from that for just a minute. My business is specializing in interpersonal workplace conflict. I got into the field of mediation and conflict resolution about 22 years ago with a background in counseling and psychology. And it really came from a driving passion I had to change the way the world of work exists. I grew up with a single parent home and a mom who had a job that she felt she needed to keep because it was important to have that safety for the family with economics and so forth. And so she kept a job she was miserable at, and the rest of us in our family suffered from that. She came home angry, frustrated, sad, and that caused a power within me, a passion within me to want to change the world of work so that people not only want to come to work, but they want to work with one another. And that's really the core motto of my company, Dynamic Team Solutions, and the work we do. We work with not just mediation at this point in time, but also with full teams and organizations, because conflict can be very distributed, and tensions and frustrations and challenges. And also leaders, even individuals in a company, can have struggles where their lack of awareness, lack of skill can cause conflict and problems within the organization. So the core point is to improve interpersonal workplace relations. And you'll notice through the program that what I'm going to talk about today is largely related to that focus of conflict resolution. And I hope it's really valuable content for everyone. So let's jump in. And as we all know, the experience of the world of work today has been different because there are new challenges, but the solutions really aren't that different. So we're dealing with issues of COVID, of course, which caused us to be remote, and even now has caused a static place where people are staying remote or staying hybrid. And that's changed the way people interact and work with each other. But it has also left us with the same problems of how do we create collaboration? How do we deliver trust? How do we manage a team when they're not in front of us and we can't necessarily work together? And so while the challenges are different because it is remote and it is hybrid, the desire for those qualities of collaboration and cohesion and trust and productivity remain the same. And so as I talk through the program, you're going to see where these situations that I'm going to talk about parallel regardless of the situation, but I will talk to these as well. The agenda, I'm going to cover the underlying causes of conflict. And this is again in a workplace setting, but it really transforms to any place in our lives, as you will hear. Roadblocks to resolution, like what keeps these situations from being easily resolved. And then of course, some strategies for conflict management that are very useful for ADR professionals to know, negotiators and lawyers to know, but also for business leaders and people in management positions to know. So we're going to jump in, and I like to start with a survey to get everybody on the same page. And I believe Sare is going to launch a poll. So those of you in the live program today can respond to this survey, but I'm going to read it for those of you who are watching later than the live program. And the question is, what do you consider to be the fundamental cause of workplace conflict? What's the fundamental cause? And here are your options. Is it poor communication? Is it workplace stress? Is it unhealthy relations and workplace relations? Or is it personal baggage? So go ahead, and those of you in the group right now are almost done with the poll. We've got about 75% having responded. And in just a moment, I'm going to share the results. You watching from your office or home off this live program, please take a moment to think of what your response would be. All right, we have everybody responded. I am going to tell you we have 72% said poor communication, and then we have a fairly even split on the other three, workplace stress, personal baggage, and unhealthy relations. I will tell you this, while the poor communications is often what we think of first, because it's the thing that's tangible. We can train people in communication. We can see the problems people are having in communicating well. And then stress, likewise, and unhealthy relations. None of those are underlying. Those are secondary to our personal baggage. Our personal baggage, what we come to the table with, is what ultimately creates those problems, what creates our ability to handle stress, our ways of communicating, and the way we form our relationships. So I think it's wonderful. Thank you for participating in that quick survey. And let me jump more into what those underlying causes are. And I think you'll smile to yourselves as you see how all-encompassing they are. So the underlying causes are threefold. They are our experiences. That is everything that has happened to us to date. the past, if you will. Our expectations, what we think is going to happen or what we anticipate, so the future. And then our emotions, what is the way we feel right now, so the present. So the underlying causes, very simply, are the past, present, and future of who you are. And I'm going to dive into those a little more deeply in just a moment, but I like to tell a story because I think it helps to color all of the examples and descriptions I'm going to give a little more fully. And this is an example of a client I worked with a number of years ago, and I have changed everybody's names to create an anonymity. But here's the situation. It was a corporation that had a financial division that was doing financial services, including building up a portfolio for, it was a nonprofit organization. And the person that had been heading it for a long time, we're going to call him Dan. And he had done so well in how he'd raised this, the level of investments and the success of them in this organization that they needed to branch out and have two different people doing it. Dan was going to be the part that did one side, and they needed to find someone to do the other side of it. Like, kind of think of it as a stocks bonds differential, but being as I don't recall exactly what it was that their differences are, we'll leave it at that. Nevertheless, they went about recruiting to fill that position, and a member of the board actually found the person they ended up hiring, who we will call Janine. And so Dan and Janine were meant to be two sides of a whole, reporting to a VP from the company. And from the very beginning, Dan, who his personality, they were both in their mid-30s, by the way. His personality was very gregarious, very collaborative. He had a team that regularly lunched with him that he got along with very well. And that team ended up split, half of them reporting to Janine, half to Dan. And those that reported to Janine were not overall very happy about that because they wanted to stay with their manager, their leader that they liked. But nevertheless, they were told they were going to be working under Janine. And Janine comes on board and she knows she's got a little bit of some ground to pull up, but she also was told because of her credentials that she had the potential over time to become the VP, whereas Dan's credentials would never have led him on that path. So they start working together, and very early on, Dan approaches Janine and says, hey, let me show you the ropes on this. This is different than the world of work you were in before, and I want to make sure you can, hit the ground running. And Janine very curtly replied, thank you, but I'd rather learn from my own mistakes. Now, they both independently told me that story, so I knew it was true. And I asked each of them, a little bit more about that. Well, Dan put it to me as this, well, as she told me, he says, she has a pedigree. And then Janine did tell me she had a pedigree. So I know, again, the reality behind that. And I said, exactly what does that mean? Ivy League trained, both Yale and Harvard for her credentials. And then she worked at some of the top firms on Wall Street prior to coming over to this organization. So she was recruited from New York, moved over to Los Angeles. And Dan acknowledged that that was a very bristly thing for her to say to him, but he moved on and he allowed her to do her own thing. But as one would expect, since she didn't really have a lay of the land and her background wasn't directly in the same type of investing in hedge funds and so forth that this organization did, she was making mistakes. She was creating problems. And these managers from the funds would call and speak to Dan, who they knew they could trust to just give a shorthand of what needed to be done differently. So Dan would try and approach Janine, who would refuse him. And again, shut it down and say, I will learn from my own mistakes. So it caused frustration for Dan. It caused frustration for these hedge fund managers and so forth that they're working with. And it caused frustration for the team under Janine. And it stayed that way for a while. So there's this simmering tension. And then Janine had a health issue. She had a health crisis. She started having dizziness and fainting. And she was put on not full medical leave, but really reduced hours to reduce her stress. It was believed to be stress related. And as a result, Dan had to pick up more of the work, and the team, a lot of it flowed back toward him, and he took it, but he was very frustrated. And he felt that it was not really a fair balance, but at the same time, took on that team player thing and worked with it. I'm going to stop there. I'll come back to the story a little further in, but I just wanted to give you that background as we dive in. So what is the impact of experiences? Our experiences can be learned or they can be taught. So a lot of times what we find is that people have the experiences that somebody has specifically told them, right? Or that they've experienced on their own. So it could be that you learned, well, it doesn't matter. We all know the things we've learned, but the things that can happen may also be from other people, stories you've been told, something you read in a book or watched in a movie. Those things become part of our past experiences too, because they make their way into our background and what we use to reflect on our expectations. Secondly, experiences come from our cultural and familial backgrounds. And that is to say, if you look at this picture of individuals, every one of them you can imagine would have a very different home life. In fact, two people in the same family can have a different home life experience. And so our experiences can come from that, whether conflict is dealt with through yelling and argumentative behaviors, or is it silence and avoidance? Those things color our experiences. Business-related experiences. And here I want to touch back to Dan and Janine. Dan's experience in business, largely his career was at this one organization where he very quickly was seen as a rising star and given a lot of authority. His experience is, like he took it out on the sports field, because he was a very big sports enthusiast as well, is collaborative, is team-oriented, is you help each other. Janine's was cutthroat. You prove yourself. You don't ask for help. And she wanted to rise up to the VP. So there may have been something in her experience that told her, you better do it your own way or you're going to be beholden to Dan. And so all of these experiences are a part of it. And, we can add in COVID now because it's changed how I think globally we relate to anything from somebody sneezing to just our tolerance for people's behavior. All of those things are a part of our experiences from having been through 2 years of tension and lockdown and isolation and all of those things. And they weren't all at the same time, but they've been stretched and they've created experiences for us. Our expectations are another thing. They're tied to the past, first and foremost. Anything we've experienced becomes part of what we expect to have happen, but it's also diversity issues. And I want to clarify, I am not talking about protected class diversity. I am speaking of things like Dan saying, anybody who says they have a pedigree is pretty much a pain in the butt or impossible to work with in my book. It is those idiosyncratic things of diversity. It could be, I don't want to work with men over a certain age. It could be, I don't want to work with a new mom. She's too flaky, doesn't get things done. It could be any number of things, but the diversity issues is a part of our expectations. It's directly what we have experienced and how we then use that to identify what to expect in our world. And also roles and responsibilities. In a workplace setting, if you have a senior executive who behaves like you would assume a mailroom clerk would behave, that's going to cause a friction with your expectations. We have those expectations based on a person's role, based on the responsibilities they hold. And a lot of that calls to what a leader's responsibilities are when I think of it. People on a team have an expectation of how their leader will handle something when they go to them. And in fact, both Dan early on and Janine later, which I'll come back to that, went to their VP for different reasons to get support. In fact, I will tell you more of the story here. So as Janine had these health issues and was in the office less, when she'd come in, she found it very frustrating to find that her team was lunching with Dan. And Dan, trying to be inclusive, even though he wasn't fond of Janine, invited her to join, and she always said no. And so her team would often go anyhow, and she understood that, but it felt very much like a betrayal. She felt very isolated. She felt a lot of discomfort from it, as I think all of us can understand. During one of those lunches, a member of Janine's team offhandedly mentioned that Janine was taking acting classes. And for anybody who's listened to the whole story, I can imagine that you're now wheeling as Dan did and saying, what the hell, right? She moved from New York. This explains it. She came here to get an acting career, not to actually take this seriously. Does she even have a health condition? How much is she exaggerating that health condition because of her desire to get into acting? And I, Dan, am taking on all this extra work, all this extra responsibility so she can go have fun. Dan was livid, but Dan didn't confront Janine about it. He didn't go talk to Janine about it. He took it out on her. He found ways of undermining her, of undercutting her, of making her life difficult every chance he got. He was so done with the responsibility he was having to take on at the expense of his own work and his own livelihood. Meanwhile, she's having fun. Eventually, the friction between them grew to the fact they were arguing and yelling in the office in a place that other people were experiencing it and aware of it. They had some loss of talent because of people on their team who just said no, and nobody in leadership stepped in. Janine finally got to a point where she talked to the VP, and he said to her, and likewise earlier on had said to Dan when he was experiencing Janine's refusal to learn early on, he said to each of them the same thing: put on your big boy, big girl pants and deal with it. That was his style of managing conflict, this leader, this VP of a very large business, large organization. He just told them to deal with it themselves. So a role and responsibility of a leader is absolutely to deal with the conflict on the team. Well, when it wasn't handled and it continued to escalate, Janine finally went to the person on the board who'd recruited her in, and she said, I don't know what to do anymore. This is a hostile work environment, which in short fashion explains how myself and Dynamic Team Solutions got involved in working with this organization, because that let a lot of alarm bells off. So the roles and responsibilities people have are tied to our expectations. What do we assume they will do given certain circumstances? And let's jump to emotions. We have two forms: crisis and chronic levels of emotion. Crisis are those sudden traumatic things, something that happens in the moment. You're in a car accident. You see a dog get hit by a car. You have an argument with somebody you love. That changes how you're experiencing your day in a profound way. And very often, no one knows about it. If it's a car accident, you might talk about it with people, depending. But if it's a fight with your spouse, you very likely will keep it very close to the vest. And for that reason, people don't know. That's part of that underlying baggage that changes how we communicate, changes how we manage stress. And what we can tolerate is very much impacted by our emotions. Chronic emotions have a similar impact. Chronic emotions are everything from a life-changing event that might be the birth of a child, or even pregnancy, planning a wedding. It can be positive stuff, but it changes how you handle things, changes your outlook, your focus, your ability to contend with stress or communicate well. It can be that you have an aging parent, or in Janine's case, a health issue. All of those impact you. I want to share that when I talked to Janine after I learned about Dan's story with the acting, and I asked her about it, and she was taken aback, and she said, how do you know that? And I said, well, Dan told me. And she now is herself thinking through, oh my God, oh my God. And I said, can you tell me about this acting class? So Janine did. She said, well, and she shared with me something I haven't yet told you. She was on the road to recovery when I met her. But she says, when I first ended up out, the doctors didn't know what was wrong. They knew I had a heart condition. And I want to remind you, Janine was in her mid-30s, married woman, no kids yet. She says, I knew I had a heart condition. I could barely function. I was so exhausted. I was fainting. I was scared. And she says, and then when they figured out what it was, they didn't know how it could be treated, how I could be helped. And she says, and my husband and I just were in this dark, dark place. And I'd work as much as I could, but the rest of the time I was home, and I just had him every time he looked at me. Every time we were planning to start a family, every time he looked at me, I would just see the sadness, see the pain. And she says, and I needed an escape. I took a 1 hour a week improv class. I just needed something to give me light in my life again. Now, I don't know, I'm not looking at everybody's face on the screen, but I think every one of us can go, oh, wow, that's hard. Now I'll give you the end result with Janine. She did get the heart condition resolved, was healthy again. By the time I met her, she was working at about 80% of her normal and was on the road to 100%. So that was her story, but Dan didn't know. Dan only knew what he'd been told. So emotions, what's happening, impact us a lot. So what are the roadblocks to resolving conflicts like this? Roadblocks to any kind of conflict that exists, not only in a workplace setting, but that's where my lens focuses. It's from our assumptions. And our first assumption that I encounter, there's 5 in total, is that someone is lying or being dishonest. Dan absolutely thought Janine was lying and being dishonest about her illness, about her desire to be in this organization and help it succeed. No doubt about it, in his mind, she was being as dishonest as a person could be. Someone is to blame. Likewise, it's Janine, she's doing this. And Janine in turn could say all this friction, all this problems are Dan's fault. They very appropriately could find a way to point the finger. The other assumptions are that the behavior is intentional. Again, Dan could very quickly, or Janine, point the finger at the other and see the absolute intent in the behaviors they were exhibiting. Fourth assumption, it's a personality difference. And I'm sure you hear this all the time. I know I hear it all the time. It's the big catch-all. Well, it's a personality difference. It's sort of a quick, easy, dirty way to say, this cannot be fixed. And it gives people this feeling of that person's bad, I'm good, and the problem will not go away. And the last assumption that people make is the assumption that everyone else sees things the same way they do. And we are all appropriately guilty of this, because this is a really healthy way in many ways of us surviving through society, is to not think that we are the only one in the world that thinks when there's a green light, it means go. That when there is a gunshot, that means there's danger. We need to assume that everybody's going to see things the same way. But at the same time, when there's issues of conflict, very commonly, it is not that everyone sees things the same way. We're just sometimes silent with our disagreements, which is okay. If we're not directly involved in the conflict, staying out of it's really common. But people end up thinking that if they're upset with it, anybody else would be. If they're outraged, it's appropriate. And that feeling emboldens them. That assumption emboldens them to dig in a little deeper. And those all create roadblocks. They keep us from being able to resolve the conflict. But there's hope, because it's not too hard to manage those roadblocks when you start understanding them a little bit better, because these roadblocks are really just a way of the person who's experiencing the conflict, who's throwing up those reasons. It's their way of saying, I don't know what to do. And if you ask them, I always tell business leaders, did you ask them what they've done? And quite often the answer is no. But if they say yes, the answer of what the person told them they've done is almost always the same. I've waited for them to change in one manner or another. I've forgiven them. I've given them more time. I've let it go. It's all this stuff that still goes on the assumption that the person is to blame, is doing it on purpose, is these other things, and they're just giving them time. It's incredibly rare that the answer is, oh, they actually tried to speak to that other person. And so managing the roadblocks, first and foremost, is to recognize people often feel stuck and they do nothing. So let's figure out how to climb over those roadblocks. I'm going to talk about some philosophies I have about this, and these help to build alignment between people that are in conflict. And there's three different philosophies, if you will, in here. The first one is vindicate, don't villainize. And this is as good for us on a day-to-day basis as it is for people directly in conflict. It's to make an effort to see what is the reasons this person did this that are justifiable, that are appropriate, that we could ourselves agree with. To see it from their perspective is a part of that, being able to look through a lens of somebody else's life. Now, Dan thought he was doing that, right? He thought he saw Janine pretty clearly. She is doing this because she wants to be an actress. She is doing this because she wants me to do all the work and she gets the pay, through disability. All these things were in his head. They were incorrect, but they were in his head. He didn't talk to her. He didn't seek to vindicate her by saying, Janine, what is up with this acting class I heard you're taking? He didn't do that. He dug in. And finally, an essential philosophy is to realize that people really do want things to go well, and they want to be at their own personal best. That is genuinely what most people want most of the time. So I want to give you an alternate viewpoint, an alternate level of assumption to make in conflict, in times of conflict, in times where there are situations like Dan's and Janine's. And so here is the assumption I would like you to make. And there's three parts to it. The first part, assume whatever is happening, the other person has a very valid reason. And this is sort of the flip side of everyone thinks like me. They must have a valid reason because in their head, everybody else would do the same thing. So it's a matter of trying to find out, what is the reason? Let me explore that. It also gives you an opportunity to be curious and to vindicate them. Try to understand, what is the reason that this happened? Second, believe they either didn't intend to create harm, in fact, we can understand Janine didn't intend to create harm. She was taking care of herself and she was doing the best she could. Or if that's not the case, that they believed that they were justified in whatever behavior they were exhibiting. In this case, Dan. Dan felt fully justified in undermining Janine because he needed her out. She was a bad seed. So if you were to ask him, did he do those things? Oh, hell yeah, she needed to go. Valid reason, believed he was justified. And the third assumption is that everybody believes they are being fair. It's very uncommon for people, especially in conflict, to think that they're doing something unfair. Even if they realize maybe they pushed it a bit far, there's a kernel of where they think it was the right choice and that it was fair, that the other person suffered from whatever challenges they put upon them. So these are the alternate assumptions that I ask people to hold. I want to take a break there. I'll actually scooch back to this. I want to take a break and allow some questions because I have another section I'm going to kind of transition to that has to do with working with leaders and what a leader's role is in this and how people like that VP can start to change the tides. So if there's any questions, can I just open it up for just a couple of moments?
You can just go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question right now for Candice. I'll just say this is fantastic, Candice.
Oh, thank you.
It's taking me back to prior positions and revisiting some of those, thinking about those. So thank you. I don't see any questions here in the chat though right now.
I have a question.
Okay, Mike.
What did you think of the VP's response, telling them to put on your big boy, big girl pants, and how did that impact on the dynamic between the two?
Oh, I was horrified and and spoke with the VP, not at length, but I did speak to him about his need to be more involved and so forth. I gave him a bit of guidance and recommended coaching, which the organization, if they did pursue that, they didn't pursue it with me or my organization. But I did speak to the VP of HR who had brought me in and had a long conversation with her about how things evolved to this point. It might be interesting to note that this particular case, when I had been brought in, it was not because of conflict between Dan and Janine. It was because of the perception that Janine was, they knew she had a health issue, so they couldn't just let her go, but they thought that she was insubordinate to the VP and trying to get rid of him so that she could step into his role more quickly. That's what they thought the problem was. Because she'd set a hostile work environment, because she'd gone to the board. And in my first conversation, not even with Dan and Janine, but with the VP and a couple other people high up in the organization, I said, tell me more about this guy, Dan, that you haven't really told me about, because I think the issue needs to start there. And I nailed it in terms of what I learned, but I didn't at the onset know that. It was just an instinct that I held that turned out to be accurate, that that's where the issue was. But that VP was seriously lacking in both awareness of his role and what he was responsible for and skills in doing that part of it. And I will be talking more about that in that second part of the program. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
And I'm sure the minute she said hostile work environment, that sent up the alarm signals for a lawsuit, an employment suit.
Precisely.
So, yeah, Robert, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a quote from Robin Williams. I think I've got it right. He said, everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always. And we assume we know what's going on the other side, and we may be right, but we also have the more we hear, the more we believe we're right, and we only hear our what's the confirmation bias. We hear things, and so we believe them. But to me, it's the idea that I think I know everything that's going on in your life, and I don't. And you may not want to share it, but I need to understand that I don't understand it. That's what I need to know. And to me, that fits with not only the work environment, but everything you've said. And this has been great. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. And I love that quote. That's going to stay with me. Can you put it in the chat if you don't mind, because then we can all have access to it. So it's a really good quote and it really speaks to this very, very strongly. Okay, why don't I jump in? We'll go into the leadership piece of this, and certainly there's going to be some time for Q&A at the end. So as I mentioned, I do a lot of work with leaders in the organization that I work in. They aren't always the reason I'm called in, but they're often where issues trail back to. And so I spend a lot of time focusing on what is the influence of a leader, and also what are the things they need to know, what are the things they need to do differently. And that's a lot of what I'll speak to, which I hope not only educates you in this information, but is something that you can carry forward to the people you're working with, and make use of this as well in that regard. So the pillars of success, they're in my mind, in the work I've done with really thousands of leaders and hundreds of organizations, boils down to there being three main pillars of healthy leadership. And that is three core competencies that a leader needs to be able to have and bring to the table with their people in order to be successful. And it's a success that becomes collaborative success. Everybody benefits. So I'm really going to focus on the conflict management, but I do want to spend a few moments talking about the trust and role clarity, because I think they're so important. I view these as a three-legged stool. If any of these three is weak, the others have no hope of being strong. They just will collapse. And so trust is the first one. And I could speak endlessly on the concept of trust, and this connects with the concepts of psychological safety, which I think is a wonderful expression that helps us to really clarify what trust means. But I want to point out that honesty is where people often go to when they hear the word trust. And in my world, honesty is the lowest rung of the trust ladder. That's the expected. We expect people to tell the truth and to be honest. There's so much more that's needed. There is a level of transparency that builds trust. There's a level of openness that builds trust. There's the respect we hold for one another that builds trust. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you do it, the more other people do it, the more cohesive and fulfilling that trust becomes, the more you build that psychological safety. Role clarity is a leader's clarity of their own role, and also how they deliver that clarity of a specific role to each member of the team, how people collaborate with each other, how people work with each other, what they understand is the give and take of their roles and the impact on one another. But specifically a leader's role, I see as three-pronged. First, and this is the first two are the easy ones. First is to have the strategic vision. Second is to be able to set the direction of the team. And that is to provide mentoring, to provide connections, to provide information, to provide technology, any of the things people need to be able to reach that goal, that strategic initiative. And then the third part of a leader's role is to remove the barriers and hurdles to the team's success. And the biggest one is conflict. That's the biggest one. Is there. I mean, other ones are important, but at least that's the biggest one in my world, because that's the one that always is why I'm called in. And so conflict management therefore connects with it. So if you have weak trust, you're not going to have conflict being resolved. If you have a leader who does not understand it's their role to resolve conflict, you're going to damage trust as well, because people are not going to go to that leader for support if that leader doesn't recognize their role is to be of help. So I'm going to dig deeper in the conflict management piece, but this is the baseline for where I'm heading. So when a team has really strong, healthy conflict management, what does it look like? What can a person expect the world of work would look like? It will look like individuals who openly go to each other to communicate, even when, and especially when things are tense. They feel like, hey, I need to go straighten this out with this individual. Now, of course, we know this only happens when trust is strong, but I've set that aside because we don't have time to talk about all of these. So individuals openly communicate about and through times of stress and conflict. Problems, as a result, become identified and can therefore be resolved and addressed at the earliest stage. Issues can be addressed because they're simpler at those earlier stages. We don't have all the layers of the onion, all the tension built up, and collaboration and productivity remain high. I feel like I shortchanged you a little bit on Dan and Janine, and I don't even know if I need to call to them anymore, other than that I feel like this sadness that I didn't end the story for you. So let me do that now. When I worked with Dan and Janine, and I asked Janine, does Dan know any of this stuff about your health issues and why you took the acting class? And she was, pretty much, oh God, no, I wouldn't want him to know what's going on. Again, no psychological safety, no building of trust. That leader had pretty much failed at a lot of his role. he set the initiative and he helped the team get some of their tools. That was what he saw as his role. And I have forgiveness for the leader because he never was taught a way to do it differently. But I got Dan and Janine together and I pressed for Janine to be open about the situation to Dan, to finally illuminate it toward the room so he would know what was going on. He would know what underlying circumstances went on. And Dan's response was, first, he had two. Why didn't you quit? I was making your life hell. You thought you were going to die. Why didn't you quit? And her response was, I really believe this organization is my future. I love what it is doing and what it stands for. And I have the opportunity to rise up, maybe not for 5 to 10 years, but I have an opportunity here. I would never have had that on Wall Street. I wanted to, and I didn't want to believe I was going to die. So I wanted to keep my job. So she had a good reason for sticking it out, even when it was hard. And then Dan says, I would have quit if I was you, especially with what I was putting on you. And he had such compassion for her. And it changed everything. And the challenge for the two of them then became, how do we mend fences for the team? Because we've created a big divide in how people work with each other and a lot of confusion for the friction that's happened to date. And they were able to do a lot of repair work after that. So it's not a long distance from being honest and transparent and open to having people be able to resolve their issues. And healthy conflict management allows people to resolve things earlier, before levels of that onion are built on, before there's loss of talent that extends beyond just the Dan and Janines of the world. And of course, when we do that, collaboration and productivity are not compromised. They stay high. People can get things done. Things keep moving. So it really is a win for everyone when there is healthy conflict management. So I have 4 principles that I talk about in my book, and I'm going to go through these because this again happens to be important for the leader, but it's really for an entire team. So principle number 1 is keep it close. When it comes to conflict management as ADR professionals, even though maybe not everybody has the same experiences of it being more workplace settings that I do, it's most valuable to resolve the conflicts when it is the people most intimately aware of and affected by the conflict. So taking something to HR is pointless most of the time. You should try and resolve it first and foremost with the person you have it with, secondly, within your own team, and or with that manager or supervisor directly connected with you. The closer it is, the more knowledge everyone has of the circumstances, the more ability they have to create support of any solution that's resolved. And so keeping it close is principle number 1. Number 2 is to know every single person in an organization has a role in conflict management. For an employee, it may be just simply to raise the comments and the information about the challenges, to speak openly about it. For a supervisor or a manager, it's to take the time, and I'm going to tell you some of the steps that I use for that, to address it with those people, to talk to them through it. And for leaders and organizational executives and even HR, it's to create the structures that make that possible, that communicate about it regularly, and that inform people of what is expected of them and how they can anticipate things will be handled when conflict does get addressed or risen to the surface. Principle 3, it's better with a champion. In this regard, I mean, at an organization, having somebody that is dedicated to this point is going to help, because they can be the focal point for questions that a manager or supervisor has. It is their purpose to help with that. It can be an outside ADR professional as well, but there should be somebody championing it, somebody carrying it forward and ensuring that things are happening. And 4th, modeling matters. The more any one person does it, the more other people will do it. And so it's really important that leaders model the importance of addressing conflict, because the higher up you are on the chain of command, the more people will see it and notice it. And so it's very important that not just employees take part in this, but everybody within an organization. So I look at a leader's role in conflict management as to being remaining calm. And you can see that's an acronym. And I'm going to jump into each of these 4 pieces in just a minute, but it means connecting with your team, acknowledging the issues, listening, and only then managing the issues and making sure you have a plan to do that. So connecting with your team, that comes from developing trust with them. again, that piece of trust that I talked about earlier on, where you're honest, but you're also transparent and open, and you create psychological safety. That creates connection. And when you create connection and you also show people they're valued, that means that they're going to know you care if something goes wrong. If they feel like they're contributing to the organization, that you have value for them and what they're contributing, they're going to know you care if something's getting in the way of that. They don't have as far to go as somebody who doesn't feel valued. That person feels like there's no point. Those are the people that turn in their resignation because they've already looked for another job. Another part of connecting is openly committing. Again, this is part of that modeling principle. Openly committing as a leader to being helpful. Tell your team, I want to support you. I want to make sure anything that's happening that's creating friction or a barrier to your workflow is addressed. I might not always have the answer, but I do want you to know to come to me. I'm going to find ways to be helpful whenever I can. And then demonstrate it with action, follow up. Don't just be, lip service to it. Actually do those things. So connect is the first step. And this is a preventative measure. Every leader in the world should be doing this. Acknowledge, in other words, acknowledge the conflict. It is very common, and I'm going to come back to our VP in the Dan and Janine story. It is very common that a leader knows there's conflict, but they don't acknowledge it. They do one of these things I have toward the bottom of the slide. They feign ignorance. They pretend they don't see it, kind of burying their head in the sand. They minimize it, as the VP did, put on your big boy, big girl pants. They create a quick fix. Well, why don't we have you guys work in separate sections of the building, or we'll move this person to a different team so they're not interacting with you. That doesn't acknowledge the conflict. That does nothing to change the trajectory. It just kind of separates it and lets it, hopefully not too much, but lets it continue to fester. And often leaders also just expect it's going to go away on its own. And that kind of gives them the reason for that. And I'd like to add, it's not just leaders or managers or supervisors that think this way. People directly involved in the conflict tell themselves these same things. They're just as likely to tell themselves it's going to go away, or I just won't talk to them this week, or I'll show them through some passive aggressive behaviors that I didn't like it. So how you show you recognize the problem is by actually verbally acknowledging it. And this could be a leader saying to their team, I feel the friction every time we're on this Zoom meeting, or every time we're in the room. I feel the friction. I'm going to start calling upon each of you privately to talk about it. And I want you to tell me what's going on, because it's important that we get this resolved. We need to work as a team. So acknowledging it is step one. And also when people are resistant, because again, even employees can be the ones that feign ignorance or minimize, it's to speak to what is the damage that conflict is causing. Really be concrete with that, because if people can understand that, they understand the value in addressing it. So acknowledging the conflict is the second part of what a leader needs to do. And only then, once you've done that, it is time to kind of sit back and listen, let people tell you about the problem or the conflict. And it doesn't have to be, in times when there's a conflict, it doesn't always have to be that there's two sides you listen to in this sort of circumstance. Very different than ADR, but I'm not talking about what my role would be, where I would definitely be hearing all the sides of a conflict, but I'm talking about a manager or a leader who knows, let's say Janine is really upset. Maybe Dan's never said a word of it. And Janine comes to the VP and says, I'm having these terrible problems with Dan. We aren't getting along. I feel like he's not sharing resources. I feel like he's, instigating issues with my team. And the VP just has to listen to Janine and provide support to her, because that VP's job is not to be the conflict resolution professional. And I'll come over to that when I get to M on the managing the conflict. But the listening means learning about the issue, asking questions, being curious, getting the big picture. What are the things creating a problem for you? Why does that create a problem for you? What do you hope for? How could we make this better? All of those things. Get that other person's perspective. Very common stuff in the world of conflict resolution. Why do you see it this way? And avoid the temptation, as I mentioned, to resolve the conflict. People internal in an organization, based on the fact they cannot be entirely neutral or objective, are really not suited to resolving interpersonal workplace conflict. It is more likely to create harm than good, and I don't recommend it. Quite frankly, I don't. I Instead, tell people that for managing the situation, managing the conflict is to coach people to solve it themselves. The person is, as a leader, a guide, not a conflict resolution professional. They can work with the Janine and coach Janine how to talk to Dan about it. They can provide support and say, if you need me to be in the room, I'll be in the room, but I want you to start with this. Go up to Dan and let him know that you want to talk about it, that the situation is creating these issues, that you really want to resolve it, and that you want to sit down with him. You know, you can coach an employee about that. It's going to be hard. You need to give a lot more than what I did in that last 2 sentences, but it is possible to support conflict resolution without actually being the one that does it. Ensure that that team member, that Janine, actually goes to Dan. You know, one of the things I tell people, I say, ask them when they're going to do it, get a date and a time. Practice them with role plays if they need it. And then after that date and time has passed, immediately, as soon as possible afterward, check in and find out how it went. Because then you know, okay, the second step occurred. And you know what that responsibility you have at this point will be. Is it to support both in the resolution they had, or did the conflict get worse and you might need to call in an outside professional, or did it end up in a stalemate where nothing seemed to have been accomplished? You can't help if you don't know. And engage. I'm going to go on the assumption that through a possibly cascading level of efforts, that Janine was able to work things out with Dan without outside involvement, that the two of them, principle number 1, keeping it close, resolved it. The VP's job is to engage in regular follow-up, not just with Dan and Janine, but also with the team. What are they noticing? And be transparent. That's part of that trust building. Be transparent. I will be checking in with both of you to see how it's going. And I will be checking in with your team because it's vital that you two have a good workplace relationship. And part of my managing the situation is to do that. So remaining calm involves those 4 pieces. Final strategies for leaders. And this is what they can do outside of that calm, but it all does overlap, is it comes back to those trilogy: the trust, the role clarity, and the conflict management. A leader must consistently uphold boundaries. They need to let the team determine, or maybe they influence what the determined roles are and how they overlap and how they don't. And then the leader needs to one that helps to make sure those boundaries, those barriers are upheld, that people don't have to fight the fight to get their own work done. Providing regular and targeted feedback, both positive and negative. This builds up people's experience of being valued, but it also helps them to continually course correct and do better. It also gives the leader the ability, without creating an actual conflict resolution situation, to address issues and to help people to be different in the way they're responding to each other, if that is important. Again, connected with that is the dealing with difficult personalities. Sometimes a leader will need to speak to somebody who's creating friction and say, hey, you're creating friction, you're creating these issues on a team. We see that very often when we work with teams in conflict management situations and conflict resolution. And one of the things I tell them, again, going back to that transparency, if you're dealing with somebody who's got a difficult personality, chances are it's bled into the team, and that's how you know about it. Do not do it in secret. Tell the person that, you know, come up with ideas or solutions of what will be next, and tell them, I'm going to share this with the team. That way the team can support you, but they can also let me know if it's not happening. It keeps people accountable. And the transparency allows you to do it without feeling like you're breaking confidences. And I think that's hugely important, because the rest of the team, as I've often seen, will not know you've done something if that person does not change. And that undermines the leader. And finally, create a path for people to share their difficulties. Make sure they know how to come to you, why to come to you, when to come to you, so that they can make those choices. It's, again, goes back to those principles I brought up in the modeling. And then have a plan for how you're going to address the issues they bring to you. It may be, okay, this level of issues, this experience of coaching, I can deliver. And if I cannot, I know when to call HR, when to call my leader for support, when to call an outside professional. Have a plan. If you don't have a plan, and I can say this because it's happened to me dozens of times in my career, we get calls for mediation, and before we've even if we get the proposal, before anything's been signed off on and anybody's ready to move, one or the other, or sometimes both of the individuals in conflict have left. The only reason we get called is when those people are of value. If they aren't of value to the organization, they don't mind that they're leaving, or they just let one or both go. These are people of value who walk. I had 4 of them within a period of 2 months earlier this year. Got called for mediation, and then the person left because that company was not poised or prepared to engage. They didn't know who their ADR professional was. They didn't know what they wanted to do as a next step, and they weren't ready to move when they needed to. By the time a leader knows of conflict, it has been going on for a long time. Think of Dan and Janine. It is not a new issue by the time they bring it to their VP. It is gone past the point of them being able to let it go and ignore it. Okay, so just summing up, the things that can influence the pillars of success in conflict management is expand people's awareness of those underlying causes of conflict, the experience, expectations, and emotions. Recognize assumptions are not roadblocks. Just address them as they are. Vindicate, don't villainize, try and find the positive, try and see the real reason behind somebody's actions. They think they were doing the right thing for one reason or another. They feel justified. Vindicate them, figure out what it is, and you can resolve the issues. Know that leaders are ultimately in their team, but they also need support in knowing how to do that. Manage conflict by staying calm, connected, acknowledging the issues, listening, and then managing the team. And of always plan, prepare, practice, and then perform that conflict management by involving yourself in it. Final thing for keeping in touch, because I want to do this before I get to our questions. If you want to know more, this is my book. This is what it looks like. It's available on Amazon. There are 2 free chapters available, if not on Amazon, then on my website, which is listed to the right of the screen, dynamicteamsolutions.org. For anybody who's watching this and thinks, oh my gosh, I need to call Dynamic Team Solutions for support, there's a number to get a free consultation. And then also, I would love anybody who would be interested in staying connected to join me on social media, or send a text message to DTS at, 42828 to be able to join our newsletter. And with that, I would love to take questions.
Thank you so much, Candice. This has been fascinating. This is just amazing. I was once told to lead by intimidation. So yeah, my reaction exactly, but be that as it may. Let's open up the floor. Do we have questions? I know someone in the chat had asked about your background.
Oh, just to give you a snippet background, I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in counseling. I got trained in mediation in the year 2000. And for the first 7 years of my work in mediation, I did work with the LA County Bar Association and running a peer mediation program in schools, where, because I conducted about 200 mediations a year, I got to see about 1,400 mediations in a very short span of time. And because they were students in middle school for the most part, I got to see a lot of things that had to do with emotional things. 2 years into that, I started working on my business, Dynamic Team Solutions, which has evolved to where it is today.
Nice synopsis. Okay, thank you. Questions? Does anybody have any questions right now? Okay, well, let me ask you a question then. Leaders are not necessarily trained as leaders. Okay, let's just talk
Right.
lawyers and law firms, or, let's just go with that for the moment. Lawyers aren't taught necessarily how to run businesses. They go to law school, and they aren't taught necessarily how to be leaders. Maybe it's innate, maybe they go take classes or whatever. So I've certainly seen a lot of things that happen in various law firms that you would not agree with here based on your presentation. What would your suggestion be for someone who's an up and coming leader in whatever their business environment is?
And this is going to sound very self-serving, but I do recommend, if you can't get training within the organization you're in, and maybe you don't even know the right resources, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's books. There's, as we know, dozens of books. I would love to recommend mine. I think mine is very good for both an established leader and an emerging leader, because it really breaks down those 3 pillars of leadership, and not just what's wrong. That's the find is what's wrong. The fix is how to fix it. And then the fill is, here are the skills that go into that being different and better and where it needs to be. So it's a really good guide to do that. And I use stories, not Dan and Janine, interestingly enough, to teach that. But there are so many books out there, and I myself find many of them. I love things by Adam Grant and Brene Brown and Marcus Buckingham. And I just recommend read, enjoy taking that in, and don't believe that the leaders in front of you who've been doing it longer necessarily know all of what you need to know, because many times we are the blind leading the blind when it comes to leadership.
Sounds good. We do have a question here. Do you also work with families in conflict?
Personally, in my business, no. I did that once or twice, and I am piss poor at that. I worked with a divorcing couple once, and while I felt really good about the fact I helped them to see common ground and start wanting to heal their relationship, it backfired badly when one of them was furious that the relationship had gotten to such a destructive place when it could have been resolved earlier through better communication. So I've learned that is not my specialty, and I prefer to let other experienced professionals take on the family world. Family business is a different story, but family conflict on its own, we do not address.
Most of us are here on this Zoom are probably mediators, or at least in the dispute resolution industry. How is it that you see these dynamics play out in the mediation room, where you have maybe an executive attending a mediation, and whether it's an employment situation or, you know, something else?
I'm not entirely sure I know how to answer that question. What I see playing out is that, you know, people that are in conflict, and I see it actually in real conflict resolution, I think we get past a lot of that because both the mediation process and the ADR professionals know how to get communication going. My big strength and that of my team in mediation is really the transformative style, where we get to the bottom, we get to the emotional point. I've had many a lawyer cringe when I say, when people cry in mediation, I know we've really made headway. Cry or hug, you know, and those are our way of knowing we've been successful, is when there's that cathartic result. But I think it's just having a guide that really understands that, again, that those assumptions that I request people think of is that people do think that they have a good reason for everything they've done. They have that. And if you believe that and you look to vindicate them, you can get them to open up so much further and get so much deeper in resolving the issue.
Thank you so much. Well, I can't thank you enough. It's 9 o'clock here. Well, in California, it's top of the hour. And so thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of Jeff and Natalie and Sari, myself, and everybody who's here and who will watch in the future. What you've had to say is fascinating, and I'm sure that your food bank will get a lot of support. Again, that information is in the chat. It's the Food Bank of the Rockies. All right, so thank you, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday, same time, same place. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.